In today's video, I'm going to be talking about Angela Carter's novel Wise Children. This is for AS students that are studying the novel as part of their A level, the AS level, for the aspects of comedy course. And as you can see from this front page, I'm going to be looking at three past questions that have come up over the last few years. So this is not really to do with writing the full essay, but I also think that planning an essay is also really useful revision in terms of how students engage with the text in the right way. This is, of course, an open book exam, meaning you have the text with you. So the first question I'm going to be looking at is to do with places and the significance of places and settings, which is quite a nice question actually that came up a few years ago. The second is to do with old people being celebrated rather than figures of ridicule. And the third question is about sex, which came up about 8 years ago now, quite a while ago. So let's look at the places question first. So 3 boxes here for 3 paragraphs. That's just what I use. It could be 4 paragraphs, it could be 2 paragraphs. The most important thing is that you're answering the question. So in this case, you're thinking about 3 distinct places and discussing and analysing and evaluating how important they are to the meanings created in the novel. So the first paragraph you could write could be about Lind Court, and you could talk about the Lind Court fire, which is the climax of chapter 2. It's a very austere and grand setting, which is a place which is associated maybe with high culture, because this is a Shakespeare party, Shakespeare fancy dress costume party. But that whole status of being kind of high culture is inverted because it becomes a setting of farce, absurdity, and also debauchery, reminding us that comedy is often about lewd or crude sexual acts and bodily functions. Here would also give you the opportunity to talk about carnivalesque and magic realism because of some of the descriptions and some of the events of the chapter. But because of the ending and what happens or doesn't happen, as the case may be with Nora and Perry, it also reminds us that comedy is all about avoiding death and suffering. So nobody is killed, nobody is harmed by this immense fire, and everybody lives to see another day, being Hollywood in chapter 3. So you could write 1 paragraph about the events of the Lind Court and more specifically the fire. The second paragraph could be about Hollywood, or more broadly speaking, America, which essentially forms the whole focus of chapter 3. Dora introduces Hollywood as welcome to the land of make-believe, which immediately reinforces the illusion of art and imagination and forces readers to question what is real and what is imagined. We also in this section have the description of the stage set and Genghis Khan and the creatives which are to do with the staging of Midsummer Night's Dream have really gone over the top, and they've really kind of hired lots of real animals and real people in order to make the film seem very literal. And in so doing, the magic of imagination was taken away, because often what works best when you're staging a play is allowing the audience to imagine things for themselves. The film itself is Midsummer Night's Dream, and that in itself is a conscious decision because that play features the magical fairy kingdom in the Forest of Arden. It's a play which in itself questions imagination and reality with events that are quite bizarre and fantastical. So no wonder they've picked Midsummer as the film to do here in Hollywood. The chapter finishes with the ridiculous wedding ceremonies, where Dora essentially watches herself get married, she says, because of Mrs. Khan's extensive cosmetic surgery. And farcically, Dora watches herself get married dressed as a donkey, as Bottom the Weaver. So you could also bring in here the farce of the wedding ceremonies and the significance of those, and how obviously in comedy, formal events like marriages are subverted for comedic effect with the formality broken. The final possible paragraph, and there are other settings you could talk about, is London, which is also representative of home and 49 Bard Road in particular. You have the river, which is of course metaphorical for this idea of legitimacy, both familiarly and in terms of culture. But it's also a place of memory and nostalgia, because it's where they've lived their whole life for 75 years in this one house. This house is also where, of course, Grandma resides, and it's also the place of the grandfather clock that, as we're told at the very beginning of chapter 1, suddenly gets the right time, suggesting that something is going to happen today. And something does happen when you think of the party at the end. It's also the place where Melchior's invitation arrives in the morning, inviting them for the party later that day. And London is also representative of reconciliation. For example, when Melchior acknowledges paternity, finally, of the twins at the end. You could also say that London is also representative of Dora and Nora's roles as women being renewed as they adopt Gareth's twins at the end. So their roles as women, age 75, is also renewed because of their kind of sudden motherhood at the end. So 3 possible answers there, 3 possible paragraphs where you could talk about particular settings, but just underneath expanding on why those settings might be significant in terms of their meanings and the themes. So that is one example essay plan. The second essay plan is about old people. So this is more of a character focus. And one of the reasons why this novel is often celebrated is because it does feature an aging cast. Most of the characters by the end are over the age of 60, which is unusual. I think society does a bad thing, particularly in the West. It kind of sidelines older people a lot. So clearly this novel is basically saying age is just a number. And that in this novel, old people are actually figures of fun rather than figures of ridicule. So what could we say here? So in this case, I'd be looking for students to think about specific characters. So they might, for example, think of Grandma Chance as a good example of how older women or older characters in this novel are actually cherished and celebrated rather than being ridiculed. So she provides comic relief. She's very eccentric in terms of her belief system and her habits. For example, she's a naturist. She loves her cabbage. She's also a foul-mouthed alcoholic. She's lovable, though, and she's obviously one of the reasons why Dora and Nora have a home to begin with, because she adopts them. They ask rhetorically, what would have become of us if Grandma hadn't been around? And when she does die, it's not seen as very tragic, because Dora instead kind of mocks the fact that she died on her way to the off license to buy alcohol. And even though she was a vegetarian, they decided to eat pork at the funeral dinner. The kind of irony there. So, and the fact that she died in 1944, she died a long time ago, and yet it's the memory of her which keeps her alive, suggesting that yes, she is a source of entertainment for us. The reader likes her. The reader laughs, I suppose, at her, but in a non-malicious way. The second character could be Dora, of course. Mustn't overlook Dora and also Nora. It's surprising how many students completely forget to talk about Dora as representative of a character who has older age. Of course, she's 75, but in this novel, because of the age of other characters, compared to other characters, she's actually quite young. So she's 75, which we might think is old, but she's younger than a 100-year-old father and uncle. So time is never quite standing still in this novel. Time is quite fluid. The fact that she's our homodiegetic narrator of this memoir, and she also kind of in chapter 4 gets ready for her party, or Melchior's party, I should say, showing that she is, and Nora is as well, refusing to be defeated by age. And you could also tie in here the fact that she kind of revels in telling us about the events of the Lynn Court fire and kind of the orgy that happened outside. You could tie in the fact that she has sex with Perry as well, despite that being quite controversial and quite uncomfortable for some readers to talk about. It is also showing us that she's using those moments in her life as a way to celebrate her life rather than to just go off quietly. Although you could also talk about men, of course, because the question makes no reference to women or men, so it just says people. So you can also talk about men as well. And Peregrine, of course, is also 100 years old on this very day. He's a bringer of mirth and magic. He's also the embodiment of the clown or the comic mask, whereas his brother, Melchior, is the opposite, or the antithesis, as we might say. Melchior is the tragic mask and what is flawed about characters. He entertains others. He's a magician, of course, a conjurer. And in the events of chapter 5, we learn that he comes back to life. Despite spending the whole novel thinking that he died, he comes back to life and he's very much living and breathing. He is celebrated as well because earlier he became Dora and Nora's surrogate father figure. But even though he is guilty of incest at the end, there are moments in this novel where he is kind of the saviour, and he does save Dora and Nora from, I suppose, emotional baggage and heartbreak. And of course, he rescues Nora from the fire as well, meaning that she only lives because of her uncle. So Peregrine as well, as an older character, there are a number of things that he does which could bring celebration and mirth and merriment. I'm thinking about, for example, in chapter 3, when he pulls out a parrot or a macaw from Melchior's groin in a moment of tense kind of rivalry between Genghis Khan and Melchior. So you mustn't overlook the men either. So that's, again, 3 examples there. You might want to talk about Daisy Duck. You could talk about Lady Atalanta Lind, maybe. So there are other characters as well. Finally, the last question that I'm going to be planning with you in this video today is a question that came up, I think, in 2017 or 18, which is to do with how sex is used in the novel as always being comically absurd. So again, very similar to the first question, you could talk about Lind Court. I've literally just copied and pasted really here. But also sex as just an added layer of farce and absurdity, that you have this kind of conflation between a moment of tragedy and destruction of the fire versus revelry and sex, and creating that disequilibrium outside, and that kind of just sense of surrealism here. So the fact that also Carter keeps them in their Shakespearean names, Coriolanus stoutly buggering Banquo's ghost, or Toby Bouch and Cleopatra orally pleasuring each other, the fact that those Shakespearean names are kept is Carter's way of challenging, again, high culture that Shakespearean characters represent. You could also talk about how Dora swaps identities with her sister Nora in order to lose her virginity age 17 in the dressing room. Again, showing us that trickery and disguise is also typical of comedy, and that the men are used effectively for the women to get what they want. The fact that the twins are identical, of course, is very convenient for comedy because the men don't know any different between them. And there's just this kind of irreverent, inconsequential atmosphere to this, the idea that they get away with it. There's no sense of punishment. Finally, the last paragraph could be about the incest in chapter 5 between Dora and Perry. Even though, yes, it is incestuous, it is still sex. And I think what we need to be saying about this scene is the fact that it comes at the climax of the novel, the party, and it gives the novel, or chapter 5 more specifically, that sense of party, revelry, atmosphere. It goes very nicely with Carnivalesque theory, which I've already done a video about, this idea of reveling in disorder and breaking the rules. Very controversial, yes, but also comically described by Nora, the way in which she describes the chandeliers tinkle, tinkle, tinkling underneath them, the size of Perry being a very large man, and the fact that you have a 100-year-old having sex with a 75-year-old shows Carter clearly challenging old age as being kind of a full stop and an end. I think Carter is instead saying old age is just a number. So it is part of that climactic ending to the party, pardon the pun, but also at a high degree of irreverency and inconsequential atmosphere as well. There's no sense of, shock or distaste with this. It just happens. So the fact here that the placement of that sex scene is also to reinforce that kind of irreverent mood at the end, and this sense of, I suppose, happy reconciliation of sorts. So again, 3 paragraphs there where sex is used in the novel for its varying different reasons. So all of those questions have come up already for the AS paper for prose for Wise Children over the last 6 to 8 years or so. But really, I do this video not only to revise the novel, but also to show students in terms of how they can use the text, in terms of zooming into a particular part of the text or a particular character, and really trying to elaborate on the reasoning why they have chosen that character or that particular theme or setting in order to answer the question. Really important, of course, because this is an open book exam, to quote more liberally than a closed book. That's why you have it there with you to use it, and to talk about authorial methods as well. They're important because they're mentioned separately in the question. So you don't have to write 3 paragraphs. That's just a space to fill this screen. You could do more, you might do less. But the most important thing is to make sure that you answer the question rather than going off on a tangent. So those 3 questions have all been asked before for the AS paper for English Lit, aspects of comedy. Hopefully that was useful, and good luck in your studies.